Bragg Creek and Kananaskis is known for its rich wildlife and essential natural services such as watersheds. However, increasing land use from industry, residential development, clear cutting, tourism, and recreations are leading to significant degradations of our ecosystem, the loss of wildlife habitat, and increase in wildlife-human conflict. By overexploiting these resources, are we destroying the essence of what makes this land so special? Are we destroying the very reason why we live, work, and recreate here? If so, what can we do? Bragg Creek Wild is a local grassroots organization which believe that there are better ways to enjoy our amazing area while preserving the space and habitat needed for wildlife to flourish and for the land to continue to provide their essential services. This is the challenge that Bragg Creek Wild aims to address by working with the community, industry, users, planners, and all levels of governments. This year, we're proposing a series of 3 presentations, each building on the previous one. Tonight, it's all about understanding the cumulative impact of human activity on the land.
Anyone that knows this topic in Alberta is bumped into or read Lauren Fitch, and he in so many ways is my mentor. And one of the things he was talking to me, because he's listened to some of my talks, is the recommendation is tell people what you're going to tell them. Just lay it right out in front, and then tell it in detail, and then tell them it again at the end as a summary. And I can't really argue with Lauren because he's about as good a communicator as I've experienced. So with that in mind, here's the 40-second elevator pitch. The Greater Bragg Creek ecosystem in the Upper Bow Basin is an absolutely iconic landscape. But there's a growing and significant amount of anxiety about a suite of overlapping land uses that are modifying this landscape very quickly. And although the people of this landscape, I think, are very good dealing with the tactical, short-term issues, we're going to have to find a way of complementing those with strategic thinking. The landscape we've inherited, here's the Upper Bow Basin, is exceptionally complex in slope, aspect, topography, precipitation. And this amazing diversity reflects itself in a broad spectrum of plant communities. That's part of the amazing vista. And these plant communities translate into an absolutely stunning diversity of mammals. But over the last 5 generations, there's been a profound change in the amount of land use and the fragmentation of this landscape and the quality of what I'd call ecological goods and services. So there's Bragg Creek and 900 square kilometers around it, just a 17 meter radius, and we're just sitting 25 kilometers from the western edge of Calgary, and it's growing quickly. And that city every day, and particularly on weekends, sends people out west of Calgary primarily to recreate, and it's growing. Meanwhile, we have species like grizzly bears and mountain lions that are trying their best to meet their life history requirements, and it's getting progressively more difficult. And we can stand back and actually look at the populations, and I'll show you for the province of Alberta and for the basin, the extent to which our native mammalian biomass has been profoundly changed over the last few generations. I'm going to argue that we need to find a way of bringing the concept of ecological goods and services, natural capital, into our economic arguments, because this landscape is literally worth several $billion a year. And we're not computing those values when we consider the effects of forestry and energy and agriculture and transportation and recreation and tourism too. These land uses, as they're growing in the Upper Bow River Basin and the Bragg Creek ecosystem, we can do better with best management practices. but best management practices themselves aren't going to solve this problem. So we've had this amazing diversity of land uses over the last several hundred years, and we can't undo the past. And all those land uses, without exception, created benefits, but they created profound liabilities too. And the various organizations that are well represented in Bragg Creek need to be thinking long and hard about what they want this landscape to be when their grandkids are their age. So I've been on this landscape for about 50 years. First came here to do some work with the government, look at stream bank stability in 1975, I believe. So I'll finish with some final thoughts. So that's the talk. And those that are in a rush can go. And those that want to hear some more details can stay. So the Upper Bow Basin, there's Calgary, and there's Bragg Creek. And we can zoom into this special place that you guys say is home. And it was our home for so many years. And most of us like to focus on these charismatic megafauna like grizzly bears. I mean, hard not to, right? They're critical. But we also need to think about the processes and dynamics that actually make the system. Things like wetlands and the movement of water. So we need to move from the more sexy types of features to the more functional ones. And against this spectrum of ecosystem function and wildlife, we're having increasing footprints of land use, whether it be forestry, or rural residential, or recreation, and many more, of course. And it's creating challenges and opportunities. And what I'm seeing, even during my life, but if you go back multiple generations, it's even more alarming, is that we're incrementally, through time, fading off the natural capital of this landscape, day by day by day. So we've got an environmental sustainability challenge. So I was thinking, well, what are some other titles? And some that came to mind were literally using this landscape to death. Death by 1,000 cuts, sanctuary or suburbs. We cannot continue to do everything everywhere all the time. So we're going to start by looking at the study area. We've got to get to know it. And hopefully by the end of this, everyone's got a pretty good understanding of landscape ecology. So the study area is the Upper Bow Basin, nestled southwest Alberta, right up against the Continental Divide, just east of our friends in BC. And there it is. And there's many rivers that drain it, but the most noticeable, of course, are the Bow and the Elbow. And Calgary, where these two rivers come together. This is a landscape of 15,000 square kilometers. It's one of the most iconic landscapes in all the world. I have been in Australia, Indonesia, Argentina, and people, once they find you're a Canadian, have asked if you've seen the foothills of southwest Alberta. And you guys live in it. And in the geographic center of it is Bragg Creek, and what I'm going to call, for the purposes of this talk, the Greater Bragg Creek ecosystem. And it's an arbitrary area. I just wanted to be able to zoom in and look at land uses, not only in the Upper Bow, but in Bragg Creek. And this is a landscape that's 900 square kilometers and has a radius of 17 kilometers. What I like about this particular image is it really brings home how tight the location of the Greater Bragg Creek ecosystem is sandwiched in between Calgary and the Front Ranges. So, the Greater Bragg Creek ecosystem, and if I just use the word Bragg Creek, I'm referring to the Greater Bragg Creek ecosystem. Bragg Creek is east, obviously, of the Protected Areas Network and the Federal Park to the northwest, and Kananaskis and Peter Lougheed directly west, and to the east, of course, Tsuut'ina Reserve, City of Calgary, and administered by Rocky View, just to give a few administrative backgrounds. And of course, in that landscape lives about 1.75 million people. So some information about the landscape. Well, I used the Elsie's model that Guy described, and with some colleagues, in a way that we've done with many other landscapes like this in several other parts of the world, across Canada, United States, Australia, India, and Indonesia. And then with colleagues, and I wanted a shout out to Matt Carlson, who really helped me prepare some of this data. And I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about methodology, and if you want to talk about that later, we certainly can. And I'm not going to stand up here and tell you that we've got every single seismic line, well site, pipeline, cut block. And if someone built a shed last week, I bet you I don't have that data. But I bet you've got well over 95% of it. So I think the results are very, very reasonable. Okay. Now, before we get into that information, I just want to remind people that this is an information-rich world. The publications of people like Lauren Fitch and Andrew Nikifork and Kevin Van Tighem and Rick Snyder, organizations like CPAWS, AWA, Y2Y, Mistakis, the Elbow River Drainage, the Elbow River Watershed people and the Bow River, and local organizations, Bragg Creek Wild, Bragg Creek Environmental Coalition, and Bragg Creek Trails. I mean, there's a tremendous assortment of information and people. So way beyond what I'm going to tell you tonight. You're living in an information-rich landscape. And I had the opportunity to look at and watch Guy Greenaway's presentation to the Chamber of Commerce and talking about natural capital and how to incorporate it into planning. So if anyone hasn't downloaded his presentation, it is really worth watching, highly instructive. Okay, let's talk about balancing perspectives. So in my experience, those communities that effectively deal with these issues understand that the iconic species are worth paying attention to. So everyone that has an opportunity to see grizzly bear or native cutthroat trout, I mean, they're just spectacular. And if you can keep them on your landscape, that's saying something about your landscape. But I think you have to back up and think about the bigger picture. And I think that we are often very good in Bragg Creek at reacting to issues. And we're going to have to take some of our energy and move it into proactive thinking. We're often tactical, and that's great. But we're going to have to complement it with strategic thinking. We often think about form without thinking about function. And we're all busy, so we think about short-term dynamics and not necessarily about long-term dynamics. And so when issues come, whether it be the flood of 2013 or logging, or mountain lions eating our dogs, or we've got issue with bears, everyone pays attention. And those are symptoms of a system, and they require and deserve our immediate attention at a tactical level. And most recently, hundreds of people showed up to offer their views on the merits of logging this landscape. But I would argue that in addition to doing those things, which are all good, that we need to think more broadly and not get too tight and think about many of these causes that are causing the symptoms. And that's what I want to talk about today. It's a harder conversation. It's not as, in many ways, attractive. But for those communities that have actually successfully dealt with these issues, they take the time to understand these dynamics. So that's what I'd like to discuss. What I fear, and I've seen in Bragg Creek and many others, is that we can easily just burn up all of our energy and emotional capital by reacting to issue after issue after issue. So we're going to start by understanding the natural dynamics that drive the greater Bragg Creek ecosystem. So people are interested in wildlife. Well, wildlife in a world without people is driven primarily by habitat. And habitat is driven primarily by plant communities. And plant communities are driven by disturbance regimes. And your landscape has been around for about 10,000 years since glacial ice sheets retreated, and an unimaginable volume of water over many thousands of years rushed east and carved this landscape the way it is right now and distributed so many of the materials. And ever since then, that landscape has not been static, it's been dynamic, driven by variances in climate and hydrology and natural disturbance regimes. So we need to understand that. So that's the template without people. And those things are still going on. But now we're in a world with a lot of people. And as we'll discuss, those natural disturbances are not the way they used to be. And anyone who was around in 2013 would understand that. So we need to focus on the key underlying ecosystem dynamics. So I'm going to spend a bit of time on this. We're going to talk about climate and hydrology and natural disturbances and how plant communities grow vegetation and how it changes through time succession. And we better be thinking about decomposition, nutrient cycling, and how our soils are formed. Now, I love grizzly bears, but I tell you, I'd give up on grizzly bears in a second before I'd give up on soil. And if you lose your plumbing and the basic dynamics of a system, you're not going to have grizzly bears. So we need to be thinking about the underlying ecosystem processes and how these landscapes are put together by all these patches of plant communities and how they're getting fragmented. Because I'm going to argue that if you can maintain the ecological processes, more often than not, these other ecosystem components that really attract our attention are going to come along for the ride. So if we want all of these kind of components, I don't know if we want a shark, but anyway. And if we want these pristine landscapes, the easy thing to do is just make sure the thing functions properly. So good function generally leads to good form. So about 5 days ago, I'm running all these analyses trying to figure out how does the Bragg Creek system work? You know, how burning fires across the landscape and letting plant communities grow and logging it and letting acreages be developed and pushing people around the landscape on mountain bikes. Trying to figure out how the water moves, how grizzly bears are moving across the landscape. So my headspace is completely in function and dynamics. And so my wife, who is down in the States visiting her mom in Indianapolis, so she phones, and so we're talking to each other, FaceTiming. And so I'm building all these slides and telling her all this exciting stuff. And I'm hoping she might ask me about ecosystem function. And so she blasts me Oh Sweet Jesus and all the baby saints, run, do not walk to the barber. And apparently her mind was on form. And so being a dutiful husband, 25 minutes later I look like this. And it was kind of an aha moment. You know, we humans, I think, are wired to prioritize form over function. And anyone who's ever turned on a TV, I think, sees it, that we get all of these views of, quote, beauty, and maybe we spend less time thinking about the underlying functions and dynamics and interactions that actually form societies and give it integrity, right? And it's that approach we often take to our landscapes. Yeah, the vistas are spectacular, and I love them just as much as anyone, and I always love seeing grizzly bears. But leaves falling and decomposing, and the invertebrates that live in that litter, and how water moves through the landscape and recharges aquifers, and the role of wetlands and decomposition. These are the things that drive the system, and they escape our attention. So again, that's why we need to look at form and function. And we're going to start by going back. Go back about 10,000 years. This landscape was driven and characterized by two continental ice sheets. And at the end of the Pleistocene and the beginning of the Holocene, about 10,000 years, is when we started to see these continental chunks of ice start to melt. And you get to see the Upper Bow Basin. There it is, covered in ice. And the amount of water that rolled off this landscape over thousands of years be measured in hundreds, if not thousands, of cubic kilometers, taking vast amounts of material, rock, grinding it up, soils, carving out creeks and rivers, and giving us much of the microtopography that we have today. The Rockies were there. They didn't change the Rockies at a macro scale, but man, the surface of Bragg Creek, when you look at it, it's something, that table was set by glaciers and the ablation of those glaciers. So if we're going to understand Bragg Creek, we've got to understand those dynamics. because they created the physical setting. So let's think about that. This is one of the most diverse landscapes I've ever worked in. And so if we drape over just a good satellite imagery, and you can certainly see Calgary quite nicely, but here's the Front Range of the Rockies. So here we're looking at elevation. Tremendous, I'll call it west, it's really northwest to southeast gradient from very, very high elevation to very low. These are critical things to understand if you want to know why you've got the wildlife you do and the plant communities. A tremendous diversity in topography. Let's flip it around. So now red is low and blue is high, and we're talking about precipitation. Vast, vast quantities of precipitation at the lower part of the landscape. Temperature, excuse me, I think I completely got that wrong. Precipitation, very high in the headwaters, low below. I was thinking of temperature, sorry. Temperature, very cold at the headwaters and very hot downstream. Tremendous gradient. And if we go back to precipitation, it's the elevation, and this part of this basin is so effective at capturing moisture from these water-laden systems that keep coming on off the Pacific, right? So they capture and hold an immense amount of precipitation in the form of rain and snow, and then deliver it, hopefully, in a fairly quiet way in the spring and through the summer. This may be the most important slide to think about. This is the plumbing of your landscape. And if you can see it, my eyesight isn't so good anymore, but it should show a dendritic network of ephemeral draws going into creeks, and creeks going into bigger creeks, going into rivers. And if you know this distribution of the movement of water, then you have some great insights not only about our plant communities, but where our wildlife are too. These riparian habitats are critical. Critical to wildlife. It's also where people like to live. It also grows our biggest wood, very attractive to the forest sector. And these riparian habitats are the most heavily altered in the system historically. Water and its movement is so critical to this landscape. Now, this is kind of interesting. So this is all the moving water. We call it lotic. Now, those red things, that's lentic. That's standing water. Those are lakes. So isn't it nice that we've got all those lakes? Well, those aren't natural lakes, right? Most of them. Those are man-made lakes where humans have worked very hard to hold water back because we need it in late summer for land use. And there's a very important hint there of just how important water is to this landscape, because we're going to come back to that, because we are not taking good care of that water in many ways. And I don't know if you can see a little bit of red at the very top, and those are the last vestiges of what remains of our glacial ice sheets. Not much area there at all. And it'll be gone very quickly. Your kids, when they're your age, those aren't going to be there. So if you understand this variance in slope and aspect and elevation and topography and rain and how the water moves off the landscape, you can very quickly begin to understand why your landscape has such an amazing amount of diversity in plant communities. From the subalpine forest to the montane forest to the mixed woods further down, your shrublands, your grasslands, and your wetlands. Now, wetlands, it's sad to see so many of your wetlands are not there. They've been drained, they've been lost, including in the Bragg Creek area. We continue to lose them every year. So you put all those things together, you've got this amazing diversity of plant communities. I mean, not only is it spectacularly beautiful to look at, it's that diversity that gives you the wildlife you have. It's just so cool. So, what about biodiversity? And I'm going to focus on some mammals, but you would think that a diverse landscape would have a diversity of mammals. And sure enough, in the upper bow, you've got both species of bear, you've got fox, coyote, and wolf. On the cat side, you've got bobcat, lynx, and cougar. The ungulate community is very diverse. So whitetails, muley, elk, moose, sheep, goat. And what I think are really cool are the mustelids, the members of the weasel family. So you literally have them all, from least to ermine, to mink, to marten, to skunk, to fisher, and wolverine. Actually, I shouldn't say you have them all. I suspect we used to have otter here a long time ago. Anyway, those are found in a basin, in the upper Bow Basin. And that's just amazing that you still have some like that. So we can look at that large mammal diversity in the greater Bragg Creek area, and basically everything is there, except, of course, we don't have sheep and goat, and there's some interesting debate as to whether or not we're actually getting wolverine and maybe fisher back. I've seen the track that I'm pretty sure is a fisher. Maybe I'm wrong. And my understanding is several different people have seen wolverine. So that's really cool, because wolverine generally don't live in landscapes that have too much activity. So it says something very encouraging. Okay. So I'm suggesting our biodiversity is tied to our plant communities. And our plant communities are tied to natural disturbance regimes. So we better take a look at these natural disturbance regimes. So we've got a mosaic of plant communities that time after time, the last 10,000 years, they're always being kicked. They're being kicked by a fire, by drought, by flooding. It's never the same. So what are these disturbance regimes? Fire, insect outbreaks, beaver dams, large herbivores. Large herbivores, that sounds a little unusual. So let's think about that. So the climate and its variance is so important to these plant communities. The fire regime shapes them, reboots them. Insect outbreaks, mountain pine beetle would be a good example. All the evidence tells us that we've never been without some sort of beetle infestation if you start looking at multiple hundreds of years. They're a dominant feature of the system. That's not to say that the current frequency and magnitude is what it was. I'm suggesting actually quite the opposite, but they've always been here. Beaver were critical at holding water back and letting it recharge into our aquifers. So the system wasn't racy. It would hold water back, create these amazing wetlands. Well, we took beaver completely off the greater Bragg Creek ecosystem and upper Bow Basin for several decades, of course, after trapping as a major land use. And of course, subsequently reintroduced. So we're getting that natural disturbance regime back. And then large herbivores like bison and elk were just as important to grasslands as were fires to forest. Okay. So we've modified these regimes. In terms of climate, we've clearly changed the climate, not only in terms of average, but we're also changing its variance structure. So the frequency and magnitude of floods and droughts in many of these landscapes, including yours, is changing. And we need to be thinking about that. In fire, especially since the 1940s, we've increased the amount of effort and technology on fire suppression, so we've changed the fire regime. So not only have we suppressed it in many areas, but we have also complemented it with prescribed burning. Insect outbreaks changing to climate have clearly been altered. And we have taken bison off the system, and we started to put beaver back on the system. So things have changed. So human activity has modified all these natural disturbance regimes, and I'll tell you the long-term consequences will be large, but no one can tell you today what they'll be. But they're going to be challenging. So when you think about 2013, no one can say that that particular event was certainly anthropogenic or caused by climate change, but that kind of event, the probability of and the magnitude of is certainly tied to climate. So we're going to have more events like that. So let's look at some of these disturbance regimes. Let's look at fire. And here we're showing you all the fires that I could find data of before 1950. Some of these occurred in the early 1900s. So there's the 1950s, and I'm just going to add to them. 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, 1990s. See these small fires coming? Most of these are prescribed burns. The 2000s and the decade of 2010. I have no data beyond 2015, but when I look at this landscape, what I see is literally a paucity of fire that's been burning in much of the last several decades, primarily because of fire suppression, and also because much of this area was burned in the late 1800s, and that probably also influenced the probability of fire. So something to think about. So what will these future fire regimes look like? Well, everyone knows what happened last year, right? It caught the attention of all of Canada and a lot of people living in New York. So Canadian Geographic builds a nice map, a lot of different colors. They show every fire in Canada in the last 100 years. And most of our forests have a fire return interval between, 85 and maybe 120 years. So in theory, 100% of that landscape should burn about every 100 years. So this is not a surprising picture at all. But if you blow up Alberta, what is surprising is the paucity of fire in the last 100 years in this part of the world. And that's, I think, largely because of the significant fire suppression efforts. Calgary and all the embedded infrastructure is something that the government of Alberta pays attention to and tries their level best to suppress those fires before they become Class C fires. Something to be thinking about. And fires are heavily influenced by climate. So let's think about climate. So I grabbed what's called a regional concentration pathway model 2.6. It's just a climate change model that looks at a particular set of assumptions on change in climate. It's not a very aggressive model. It's not the world's most modest model. It's middle of the road. And so blue being cooler and yellow and red being hotter. So let's start with the decade of the 2000s, 2020s, 2030s, 2040s, 2050s. So, and when I started in 2000, that's not representative of what the climate looked like in the 1950s. That already had changed significantly. We've already experienced a good degree and a half change in the last 5 decades. What these models are telling us is that the climate we're going to experience is significantly different. And remember, your plant communities have co-evolved with climate. The climate has changed. In fact, it could be argued very, I think, validly that your plant communities in Bragg Creek today are not even adapted to today's climate. They're just waiting for insect outbreaks, fire, or logging that'll reboot them, and they're going to come back to something different. So we need to be thinking about that, the consequences of pumping that much CO2 into the air. So as we contrast what we had to what we're going to get, we're going to change our plant communities. And that's going to change our biodiversity. Okay, so at this point, we're arguing this place is exceptionally diverse. Slope and aspect relief and soils and climate creates a diversity of plant communities. Plant communities are driven by natural disturbance regimes. And out of this diversity comes this amazing wildlife community. Well, we're not alone. And this landscape is also being shaped by multiple overlapping land uses. So let's take a look at some of them. Now, First Nations as a land use has been on this landscape for a good 10,000 years. And they played a lesser role than the other land uses, of course, over the last 250 years. Human populations and their residences. There was a time, if you were sitting right here, I'd say 1820, 1840, there was a massive land use occurring. And everyone you'd see, and they'd primarily be young men, they're all participating in it. All they were doing was killing mammals to provision food to forts at Calgary. Like, it was the land use, was basically commercial hunting. We don't think about that much anymore. So, but our contemporary land uses, trapping, hunting, fishing, trapping, not so much anymore, livestock, cropping, forestry, oil and gas, coal and gravel, transport, various types of other industry, protected areas. That is a land use. That's a decision that we've made in terms of what can happen to that part of the landscape, and tourism and recreation. So those are some of the land uses that have shaped the Upper Bow Basin and Bragg Creek ecosystem. So how big are they? So let's take a look at them. Starting with the Upper Bow. And I'll leave the greater Bragg Creek circling. Crops. So our crops, which are the largest footprint we have, occur at the lower part of the basin, and they've essentially replaced native grassland over the decades. Pastures for our livestock. So again, crops, pastures, our cut blocks. And again, if you look at this, you need to remind yourself that if you're an FMA owner and you've created your net land base calculations, which means you've taken out those forests that are not commercial, those areas that are too steep, those areas that may be too close to water, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, you're left with your net land base. And that net land base, by law, I guess, needs to be harvested about once every 100 years. Okay, so 100% of the net land base, if you're going to be in compliance with the Alberta Provincial Government Forestry Act, is going to be logged once a rotation, which is about, depends on the forest type, let's say 90 to 110 years. So we're seeing, and this is not completely up to date, but you're seeing many of the cut blocks that have been cut on the landscape. And then, of course, we've got people and the urban landscape. So there's, Calgary and Turner Valley and Cochrane and all the other communities that are found in the watershed, including the hamlet of Bragg Creek. And then we get to see the bow wave of rural residential. So as the city grows, it pushes out the rural residential, it literally eats it. And so here we can see people that live in acreages. Industry, primarily in Calgary. The footprint of the hydrocarbon sector, the seismic lines, well sites, pipelines, processing plants, the mines, and almost all the mines are gravel mines. Because on average, every single person in this room, if you're an average Albertan, you're consuming 10 cubic meters of gravel per person every single year. That's the average. The water infrastructure, as we hold water back and then start to push it into irrigation systems just in the bottom part of the Upper Bow Basin. The recreation footprint, which is primarily golf courses. The trail network, a significant network inside of Calgary, and some cool stuff going on west of Bragg Creek, and then spread right through the Rockies. The road network, every land use requires roads, without exception. And so there's this road network, and you put it all together, in red, you see the direct footprint in the Upper Bow Basin. So if you want to know how many square kilometers they consume and who are the bigger players, there they are. So in this, over 3,300 square kilometers has been converted from natural habitat to a land use footprint so that we in this room can have the food and wood fiber and meals, vegetation, meat. The commodities that we need come from land uses, crops, pasture, cut blocks, rural residential, which exceeds all the urban footprint, roads, recreation, trails. And for the most part, it's growing at about 1.5% to 2.5% per year. Okay, so let's zoom into our landscape where we sit right now. Yes, we've got some crops and pasture and cut blocks. Urban, and sorry, you can't see it because I put a red dot on it, but it's right over top of us. The rural residential footprint of Bragg Creek, the mines, which are gravel mines, the footprint of the energy sector, recreation, the trails, the roads, all the linear footprints together, and then just add it all up in area. And it's pretty big. If I were to try and reconstruct it through time, it would look something like this. And the scale, the vertical scale I'm going to say it's relative political importance. And of course, it was First Nations for way before that, and their influence is not as much as it used to be. Then we had a wave of trapping and market hunting. Forestry has been going on for well over a century and a half. Agriculture on the livestock side in this landscape, residential has become more important. And in recent years, we're seeing this exponential growth of the demand for recreation. So it's a combination of all these land uses, without exception, creating significant benefits, but also fundamentally rewriting this landscape. So I want to move from the static part to the part about time, because I think it was a guy said the severely normal human. Well, the severely normal Albertan or human, I think, really struggles with the concept of time. As landscape ecologists, we call it Pauli's ratchet, which means we can detect a certain magnitude of change. So a 10% change, I can readily see. But if I'm walking through a year, 365 days, so that's 1 year, and something changes at 1.5%, 2%, most people can't even detect it. And so if you've been living on this landscape for 30 or 40 years, it just kind of gently changes. It's called Pauli's ratchet. I'd like to give an example. I haven't seen Guy for, how many years, Guy? A decade probably, right? So I'm out there, and he walks in, and he sees me, and the guy's a really polite guy. But I could see the shock in his eyes, because he hadn't seen me for quite a while. And I'd aged a lot. And so he saw the contrast. Like, this is what Brad looked like a decade ago. Here's what Brad looked like today. And, we got on to a nice conversation, and he was polite enough to say, oh my God, you haven't aged. So he saw meaningful time. Now, in contrast, pretty well every day I wake up with my wife, and she sees me every single day. And she's not noticing the facial decomposition because it's so gentle. But some guy Greenaway, I don't see him for a decade, and he goes, oh, what the hell happened, That is what we need to think about. So I'm going to try and show you meaningful time and land use history. And to do so, and I think it'd be helpful to think about, our lineages. So there's my grandfather, arrives in Alberta in 1905. My dad's born in 29. I come in the late 50s. Our daughter, Kate, is born in the early 1990s. And so it's worth thinking about how these landscapes have changed during their life. And so here we go. The 30s and the 40s. This is a heat map. Where it's red, there's lots. Where it's transparent, there's none. And it goes from green, very little, to red, a whole lot. This is the total footprint of the Upper Bow Basin over 4 generations. So then Kate has a baby, my granddaughter, and she's born last year. And so we can then simulate the change from Kate to Charlotte. And then the model is literally pushing the landscape into the future. And it's using the best available data on forestry and energy and agriculture and transportation. It's not modifying their business rules, just saying if they do what they say they're going to do, how's the landscape going to change? And so in 2010, we had 3,340 square kilometers. By 2060, we're up to 4,300. So things are changing. This landscape is not what it used to be. Now, having said that, anyone who just arrives here for the first time thinks it's wonderful, and it is. So it's an interesting perspective. So let's break that land use down into a bunch of the types. Here comes our croplands. And right there, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. You notice as the decades go on how the croplands disappear around Calgary? Well, because Calgary's expanded, right? And those croplands take a lot of water, at least some of them do. Okay, there's our crops. Let's look at forestry. And again, we talked about how The forest companies are by and large obligated with current rules to harvest 100% of the merchantable wood on their net land base once a rotation. And I'm not for a moment suggesting that the rules that they follow are good ones. In fact, I think for the most part, they do not address ecological goods and services the way they should. And there's a key conversation there, I think. So here's the basin, and let's see how our cut blocks arrived on this landscape in the 1960s, 1970s, 80s, 90s, 2000, 2010, 2020. And every time they come into our landscape, into our backyard, we get upset because we see the liabilities, and there are liabilities. And yet it's unfolding just the way it's supposed to, given the rules that have been set up for commercial logging. And if we don't move from, again, the more myopic, short-sighted, reactionary, tactical approach to actually being part of the conversation about how timber is allocated, and more importantly, how ecological goods and services are brought in, we're going to continue to be living that world. So here we're going to move into Bragg Creek, and we'll look at the same. You can see the cut blocks coming decade after decade, changing forest age class structure. Every cut block has to have a road to it, in-block roads. How are we managing those? How are we reclaiming them? How are they bumping into other land uses, such as recreation? So, none of these land uses can even exist, or would be required if we didn't have people. So let's start talking about that. So, let's take a look at the residential footprint, which is basically the same map as population, but let's let it grow decade by decade. See, has it started yet? I better start it. Oh, there we go. I'm going to run that one more time. Okay. 20s and 30s. It's just slowing down. Maybe my computer's getting hot. Anyway, it's important to see how Calgary's growing. And of course, this is going to lead to a conversation, I think. Is Bragg Creek destined to become a suburb in Calgary at some point? So let's think about that. There's Calgary, about 722 square kilometers as of last week. And here we get to see the population and how it's grown historically. All of that data is empirical to the left and projected into the future. My eyes aren't so good, so I'll wander over here. But it basically says if we could come back here in 2070, we should have about 3.5 million people living in Calgary. So is Bragg Creek destined to become part of the sprawl? Calgary had a footprint of 93 square kilometers in 1951. Some of the people in this room were alive. I was almost alive back then. By 2007, it had grown to 580 square kilometers. We used a very simplistic model and said, if Calgary continues to grow the way it did and continues to grow in population, I think we had it at 2.5%, by 2057, basically in about 25 years, it would be almost 2,000 square kilometers. Now, fortunately, in the last 5 or 6 years, there's been a fair bit of conversation, I think, largely led by Nenshi in Calgary, about the downside of sprawl and the need to grow up more than grow out. So Calgary is starting to densify. But again, if you measure it right now, it's 722 square kilometers in 2024. So it continues to grow, but it's beginning to densify, which is great. And we really need to push that for many, many reasons, in terms of all the ecological goods and services. But as Calgary grows, every day, and particularly on weekends, it's sending its people out for recreation. And not all of them, but many of them head west, heading to Banff, heading to Bragg Creek. And that land use has grown significantly. And I think that growth trajectory has just started. I think the average Calgarian doesn't even know about West Bragg Creek yet. So we've got this amazing infrastructure, network of trails. They've been rebuilt to try and follow some better rules in terms of topography. And people are coming out to use it, which in many ways is great. People need recreation. And this happens to be the closest access to Kananaskis for Calgary. And thanks to Eric Lloyd, we've got some data. So I plotted the historical data. Eric gave me some data back to 2007 a few days ago. And this is the stunning part right here. The exponent that best fits the historical data is 12.5% a year. Can you imagine if any of us were assured of getting 12.5% a year on our investments? I can't even run 12.5% because the numbers are obscene. But if you run, and these numbers are number of vehicles entering into the parking lot. But if you run 3%, 5%, and 7%, by 2050, we'll have about 220,000 vehicles per year in the lowest case scenario. Probably much more likely to have around 630,000. Now, if we convert vehicles into person days, the people that are actually out there, we're sitting at right now about 220, and that will grow to somewhere between 500,000 and 1.3 million. So that's a pretty major change. And that is based on a Calgarian growth rate that is way slower than what this current provincial government wants to see. Okay, so where will future Calgarians go to recreate? Let's think about this. 1.8 million people in all of the watershed. The average Canadian is spending about $4,000 a year on recreation, about $7.2 billion a year. Let's say only 20% of it is spent inside the basin. That's $1.4 billion per year. So where are they going to go? Well, some will go to Banff, some will go to Kananaskis. So here's some people heading out to Canmore, out to Banff. Some are going to do the big left-hand turn and head down to Kananaskis. But there's the greater Bragg Creek ecosystem, the closest way to get to Kananaskis. They're going to go to Bragg Creek, they're going to go to West Bragg Creek. And then the question I think is to consider is, as time becomes more precious, as fuel costs become higher, as people become more concerned about carbon footprint and recognizing that Bragg Creek is the closest access to Kananaskis, this could become an exceptionally busy place in terms of recreation. So to what extent does the Bragg Creek community want to capture this growing market? What are the benefits? What are the liabilities? And what qualities and natural assets would encourage them to come here? And how will it harm your natural capital? Things worth thinking about. Okay, so there's Calgary, frenetic place. I live in Calgary. As my kids know, after about 6 days in there, I get an itch to leave. You get anxious. And people need to leave, and they need to connect with nature. So someone may be up here in 50 years talking about this as the most important land use in Bragg Creek, because you now have 4 or 5 million people that need to get out of the city and commune with nature in some way. Okay, so we've now quickly looked at land use. Let's look at how it's affecting wildlife. Are we balancing the opportunities and risks? So about a week and a half ago, I'm riding a horse West Bragg Creek with a friend, and fresh grizzly track from the night before. It had been raining, and it got me thinking, okay, how are these large predators moving through the landscape, which is becoming so increasingly busy and meeting their life history requirements, and leaving people largely alone so far? And then Eric sent me a picture May 6th, not long ago, of a grizzly walking basically through the West Bragg Creek parking lot. So when you think about this network, and 220,000 people last year moved through it, it absolutely stuns me that we do not have a sobering story that's already been told about a mauling or killing. It stuns me. I don't understand, given we've got reasonably healthy cat populations and not a bad bear population, and we've got them intermixed with this many people. I just don't understand how we've been so lucky. And one of these days, we're going to hear some really bad news. And it's going to make me wonder whether or not we've really thought about these dynamics and taken all the precautions that we need. So think about right now, being a predator on a busy landscape, kind of running the gauntlet. How do you meet your life history requirements? So whether you're that bear or that cat, you've got to forage, you've got to kill stuff, you've got to find water, you've got to mate, denning, predator avoidance, thermal stress, and the most important thing is you've got to spend another day and try and stay away from humans. And on these landscapes, we've got our rural residential, we've got our trails, we've got our cut blocks, we've got the road network, the linear features, and there's this hypothetical grizzly bear just trying to get through the landscape without bumping into people. This is a cartoon, by the way. Okay. So, these bears have seen a significant loss in physical habitat in the Upper Bow Basin, and including around Bragg Creek. They have spatial and temporal conflicts with recreationalists. They know where we are. They do a really good job for the most part, and they try and stay away. But then they try and partition time by saying, okay, I'd ideally like to be there in the afternoon, but I've got to be there between 2 and 4 o'clock in the morning because there aren't hikers. So we have to think about this temporal partitioning. Think about whether we want a lot of people hiking in West Bragg Creek at night. Road collisions are a big problem. And these apex predators have really, really slow reproductive rates, right? You don't have to kill a lot of them before the population can turn. And we harass them with dogs. Now, this is not a good picture. These are Karelian bear dogs, which are being deployed to actually encourage bears not to be around people. That's a good thing, but I couldn't find a better picture. And then we have all these vehicular collisions, and I grabbed some data thanks to Grant Chapman out of the Cochrane office, Fish and Wildlife. I was just looking at the Bragg Creek area, and my eyes again are pretty bad, but I think it says 182 bear collisions recorded, and this goes back about 25 years, and this isn't an incomplete data set. But anyway, just the point that as we have more people and more transportation, we're bumping into these things. Now, most of you, okay, here's Bragg Creek, here's West Bragg. This is an area that our trail network gets into, and there's a massive wetland complex, only a few kilometers from here. And it has all of these species, I can tell you, because I've seen them all or seen their tracks, except for the wolverine, but I put it in there because other people have. And I'm here to tell you that there's no other place on Earth where you can get this diversity of predators and ungulates within 100, let alone 30 kilometers of a city of 1 million people. And these things are within 30 kilometers of a city of 1.6. That's like a Serengeti ecosystem dynamic. And most Calgarians don't even know about it. But it's just, and the key reason they're there is it's very, very difficult to get into that particular area unless you work hard at it. So it's just in the shadow of Calgary. So imagine you're up on telephone, lift yourself up about 400 feet, and you're looking east towards Calgary, and Calgary's growing, and you've got one of the last vestiges of mammalian biomass diversity that's just unparalleled. And then Danielle Smith, I think in her Crown speech, said we want Alberta at 10 million by 2050, which would put at least 4 million people in Calgary. So even if we do a much better job of growing out versus up, we're still going to, or go up versus out, we're still going to see a significant expansion. So I want to show you some data that initially I wasn't going to, and I had convinced myself was wrong, but isn't wrong. And I think we need to understand, because we think these things are cool. But they are maybe not species richness, which means are we losing the species altogether, and they're not there. But we are losing the numbers and the populations for sure. So this shocked the mammalian the mammalogists and landscape ecologists, when Hannah Ritchie published this a few years ago. So she basically took every mammal on Earth in the oceans and terrestrial and lifted them up and weighed them, 100% of them. It's about 1 billion ton. Everyone knows what a mammal is. We're pretty good at separating them from birds and reptiles. 1 billion ton. And her work is rigorous, I can tell you. And 34% of all mammalian biomass on Earth is humans. And 62% are livestock. And 4% are wild. That's all that's left, 4%. And most mammalogists, landscape ecologists thought, no, this can't be right. So we kept rereading her work and looking at the methodologies, and she and her colleagues have nailed it. And of course, it's that kind of results that create these kind of cartoons. And you know, when I initially saw these, I thought, no, that's hyperbolic. That's not how it is. And so I've spent much the last couple of years running numbers, and these kind of images are not unfair depictions, I think, of what's going on. So I'm going to show you, and you're the first people to see it. It's now been done for Alberta. These are our large mammals. The ones up here are people, they're pets, and livestock. The ones down here are wildlife. Here's their weights. Here's their populations, pre-European and current. So what did we have 300 years ago? What do we have today in populations? And how does it translate to weight? Pre-European and today. You might want to guess before you see the results. So for much of the 10,000 years since glacial ice sheets retreated, we had people on the landscape, we had wildlife, and these people didn't have horses for the most part until more recently, but they certainly had dogs. And then today, with humans and our livestock and our pets. So how does it play out? So, pre-European, current numbers. These numbers are weight, biomass, in units of kilograms. So if we could just snap our fingers, go back 300 years, we had 1 billion kilograms of native wildlife in Alberta. And it would vary, probably within 10 or 15%. Decade to decade, century to century. That 1 billion has been dropped to 87 million. We had people and pets on the landscape, 4.3 million kilograms, and today it is 2.3 billion kilograms. And the black just are the total of the previous two. So what do we know is that we've reduced our native mammalian biomass by 92%. And we've increased our human and our livestock and our pets by 504 times. That's like 5,400%. And so that's the provincial story. That's, to me, absolutely alarming. It's really not any different than what's going on globally. Upper Bow Basin, we haven't lost as much. It's more like 70%. Greater Bragg Creek has lost more like 40%. We still have reasonable populations. But these are the hard data that show you what happens when you're not paying attention to Polly's ratchet. Okay. So if you want to see the species, here's pre-European. This was primarily a bison and elk system. And here's what we have today. It's humans, cattle weigh, okay? Sorry, this is populations? Yeah, this is population, not weight. So we've got more people than cattle. So we've fundamentally changed the system. So I want to go back to 10,000 years, because that's about when those glacial ice sheets retreated. And if we look at those kind of data sets, what we find as far as native mammals is that it looks like they're doing pretty good. Except for the last few seconds. Well, over 10,000 years, those last few seconds are the last 500 years. So let's look at those 500 years. 500 years ago, today, First Nations doing their thing. Anthony Henday arrives about 250 years ago. The fur trapping era is well established 200 years ago. We've decimated the bison herds of Alberta by about 170 years. Homesteaders arrive. Our cattle populations are grow, Leduc number 1 blows in, and then we see this massive expansion of intensive cultivation, livestock, logging, and human populations. And over those 500 years, we see a trend like this. So, kind of a sobering trend, but that's the trade-off. That's a trade-off that we've either knowingly or unknowingly made. And regrettably, the story in birds is about the same. Some really good work done by Ken Rosenberg and his colleagues show that since 1970, we seem to have lost about 3 billion birds in North America. And if we look at this, which is the western forest, this is the best example, about a 30% reduction. And I mean, I first came here in the mid-1970s, but we lived here until about 15 years ago. I've been out here a fair bit recently, and the birds are down. You don't really have to be paying attention. So, a couple other weird things. I looked at all of our native wildlife in the Upper Bow. Sorry, this is in Alberta. I just wanted to compare it to cats and dogs and horses. And so cats, dogs, and horses, we got 136 million kilograms of dogs, cats, and horses, and 87 in every single native wildlife mammal. I mean, our pets outweigh our wildlife by 56%, not including any humans or any livestock. And we like our birds. So we've got about 850,000 in Alberta, weigh about 3.2 million kilograms altogether. Here's where they live. I mean, what's not to like about a cat? So using some data from the Bird Canada database and simulating them, and this includes ones that are both outside and ones that are inside because it's weighted across. We're killing 4.5 million birds per year by cats in the province of Alberta, basically equivalent to number of people. And we need to be thinking in Bragg Creek about people that like watching nature, bird watching, and they spend significant amounts of money. You can even go onto the web, and Bragg Creek is advertised as a good place to go and watch birds. People are spending millions of dollars in Bragg Creek, in the Upper Bow Basin, on observing birds. But that bird community is failing us. So if we look at land use history through time, yeah, there's been a trade-off. So we need land use, forestry, energy, agriculture, transportation, residential, but we're losing something. So that leads us to a conversation about triple bottom line, managing for economic, environmental, and social. We've been talking about it for decades. We don't do it. People need to understand the ecological goods and services that natural systems provide us. We can't live without them. They're critical. They're measured in the billions of dollars, and we don't incorporate them into the way we think about land use. Some of you will recognize this guy. Passed away a few years ago. Harvey Buckley used to be a counselor in Rocky View, and he did recognize it. And so he asked us to do some work on natural capital and ecological goods and services. Alan Brakey was a big supporter of that project. And so I wanted to show you a little bit about that. But he was basically asking the question is, what is our natural capital? What's it worth? Where's it found? How's it doing today compared to, say, 100 years ago? So we looked at water quality, water supply, carbon, and tourism, and examined how these natural capitals feed into our system and give us the quality of life that we have. And I'm not going to go through all of the list from pollination to decomposition to cleaning our water, but this is an attempt to monetize natural capital and see how it is affecting our bottom line economically. And I'm just going to show a few. This is on water quality. And this is the Upper Bow. So we have lost about $10 million a year, every single year, because of our land uses. And that's what it would cost us to take that water that has excessive nitrogen, phosphorus, and other components and clean it. And here's where we'll be in 70 years, about $75 million a year. What we've done is said, okay, this is using current practices And this is looking at best practices, and we can make a chunk of that, we can basically make $55 million of damage disappear by adopting best management practices. So we need to adopt best management practices. In terms of carbon, which is so critical, it's degrading. And in 70 years, we're going to be we'll have lost about $200 million per year of the value of carbon. But yet, adoption of better practices can mitigate some of that away. It doesn't change the slope of the line in terms of its direction, it just changes how steep. And what about recreation? It's exceptionally valuable. I mean, we're talking about what? $1.35 billion a year, and it's degrading through time. And best management practices with forestry and energy and agriculture and transportation can improve it. So we listed all these best management practices, but I'm going to summarize them for you. So for these various land uses and these key natural capital, what did we learn? With forestry, we need wider riparian buffer strips. We need higher in-block retention of green trees. We need faster road reclamation, longer rotation ages, and improved integration between forestry and other land uses. Those are the key levers when we ran the model that had the most benefit. And there would be a consequence in terms of cut. In terms of residential, it should apply to all of us in this room. We need to talk about discouraging urban sprawl. We have to stop draining wetlands as we build acreages. We need to look at clustered rural recreation residential rather than spaced uniform acreages. Improve septic systems and pet control were some that surfaced. In terms of recreation, we needed to go to a designated trail network, avoid sensitive areas, minimize or restrict OHVs, look at better human waste management, pet management, minimize night activity. For crops, we've got to get away from riparian habitat. We've got to reduce the nutrient, sediment, and herbicide runoff. We have to stop expanding our cultivated lands into native prairie, and we need to convert cultivated lands to perennial lands. For livestock, off-stream salting, manure management, greater emphasis on perennial grasses, and reduced emphasis on annual forages. All of those things, we're not talking about getting rid of land use, we're talking about changing it. All of those had billions of dollars of improvement. So we need to talk about moving forward and going from tactical to strategic, as I'm going to start wrapping this up. For people in this room and all these issues that confront us, we need to continue to pay attention to the issues of the day. That's a short-term, tactical, immediate. Those are important. But we need to lift our head out of the sand a little bit and talk about the long-term issues. So again, remind ourselves of the land uses that shape this landscape. But start thinking about the future and being bold about what it is we want when we grow up, because we're getting something whether we want it or not if we're quiet. We need to be thinking about what amount of time in the future. We can talk about when your kids are your age or when your kids are your grandparents' age. And there's an amazing diversity of organizations in and around Bragg Creek, I think, that have some very strong views. So how do we sell the story? What is the narrative? Well, I think part of it is under ecosystem services. So this is your system. This is amazing. It's one system. It's integrated naturally. We've just decoupled it through our approaches on our land use. So there's Calgary. We're providing them with clean, abundant water, or can. It's still pretty darn good. There's still amazing biodiversity. There's still amazing carbon sequestration. All of these amount to several $1 billion a year of value. We need to make all the stakeholders aware of that, and we need to incorporate those values into any decision making. Let's move to recreation and spiritual. So non-motorized recreation, spiritual recharge, that's another very important argument. I think things are beginning to change. I mean, look at Sarah Amaligi, and she won in that Kananaskis riding, that Banff Kananaskis riding. And for those of you that followed her, she was telling this story in a much more elegant way than I am. She told a story about natural capital and maintaining ecological goods and services. Her story was not an anti-business strategy. It was a pro-business strategy that incorporated natural goods and services. I read a fascinating letter by Eric Lloyd a couple days ago to the Premier talking about logging. And Eric just basically laid out all of the key best practices that we learned from Harvey Buckley's study a decade ago. That we need to be doing these things. Not that we're not doing them at all, but we need to do them better. And the most important story, I think, was we've got recreation over here and it's doing its thing, and we've got forestry, and they're not properly integrated, and we're bumping into each other. So these landscapes that seem to be so big with so little going on now are getting to feel very, very small with lots going on. So who's the audience? This room, I guess, for sure. We need to think about this and discuss it. Calgary, for sure. Is it the councillors of Rocky View or the mayor of Calgary or MLA or a premier? Yeah, for sure. But I think we'd be foolish not to be wondering about who's making tomorrow's decision makers. And I'm pleased that Jen Jansen and her daughter, both of which won Emerald Awards, have been out in Bragg Creek and at the school talking about Alberta Tomorrow, which is being used extensively across Alberta in schools to let kids literally grow landscapes in the future and understand the trade-offs, where they get to be the premier for a day, they can make whatever decision they want and see what it does to food and water and grizzlies and wood fiber. And so these kind of programs can help our kids tomorrow understand that land uses without exception create benefits, and without exception create liabilities. And we're not managing this landscape in a way that is integrated. They're all bumping into each other. So that leads us to probably the key message, which is priority land use. Our system only has so much to give, whether it's wood fiber or biodiversity or water. And every one of these land uses exists. And they exist in silos. And they need to be integrated. And the land use framework was supposed to deal with this issue. And my organization, the colleagues I worked with, were pretty front and center for 3 or 4 years looking at that. And as it was deployed in Alberta, it was essentially abandoned because the government and industry came to realize that if you integrate land uses, you can't find a win-win, win-win scenario where everyone can do everything all the time. What it required is trade-offs. It required people to have discussions about what are the priority land uses, and that was an unpalatable conversation for government and industry. So all the organizations in around Bragg Creek, we need to have that discussion and demand that we move into integrated landscape management, or it's going to literally be death by 1,000 cuts. So I can guarantee you every day these sectors are sitting around the table figuring out how they're going to deploy their business plans, and without exception, they're based on growth. And the organizations that are red are largely left with what remains. So we need that conversation to talk about this landscape and what it's supposed to do. And you know what? We've got power of place. We are generating ecological goods and services that, if known, Calgary would not want altered. And so we've got all these organizations that need to beat that drum and make people aware of the phenomenal assets that this area has. So here's the kind of, I think, the most critical slide, but it's not very pretty. What do we have in Bragg Creek? Aesthetics, water, naturalness, wildlife populations. That's why all of you guys at one time or another went and walked into some realty office, whether it be 50, 40, 30 years ago. Those features are being degraded every single year by land use footprint and the intensity of human activity. These create benefits, but I guarantee you they're bleeding this natural capital. Now, we can make some of those problems go away with best management practices. Dealing with pets, how you conserve habitat, pest removal, bird feeders, drive slow. These things we need to do. These are best management practices. But the problem is land use footprint intensity of human activity is being driven by increasing human population. Every single year we have another 2.5% more people on this watershed. And every single year those people are also increasing their per capita consumption, whether it be wood, water, energy, food, recreation, or consumables. Like the amount of this material that we consume today is nothing like it was 10 years ago. Okay? So there's more of us consuming more. And they're all driven by an economic growth strategy that says we've got to grow. So the analyses show that increasing number of people, and the per capita resource consumption of wood, water, energy, food, recreation, the upper bow, has led to a loss of natural capital. That is just hands down a fact. Now, best management practices are really helpful and good, and we need to do them, but they're not going to change that trend. It's going to be overwhelmed by the number of people and their demands for resources. So when we look at these landscapes, and you guys know where this is, see that bridge? Yeah, have they changed? Yeah. But what remains is still comparatively remarkable. The natural capital is still phenomenal. You can still find these species. You can still see them. You can still enjoy Mother Nature. There's still places to go that make you feel good. It's still a beautiful landscape. It's still an iconic landscape. It's one of the most iconic in the world. So yes, our natural capital has been degraded, but still much remains, and it deserves our attention in terms of how we manage it. So what can we do? Well, we need to get engaged. The individual level, I guess talks like this, reaching out to these people, watching Guy Greenaway's presentation. At the property level, there's a whole bunch of things you can do that the model says is going to help. You can maintain native habitat on your property, minimize your built footprint, protect wetlands, control your pets, remove food attractants, remove invasive species. Those all help. At the Bragg Creek level, reduce the trip frequency and your travel speed. Support local services, minimize trips to Calgary, discuss trade-offs of Calgary's recreation trajectory. Get these students to learn about the future in meaningful time using technologies like Alberta Tomorrow with Jen Jansen. Discourage built capital in riparian habitats. Stay away from riparian habitat to the extent you can. And participate in citizen science projects, and Dave Klopaki's got some great ideas there. On the regional level, the model screams, someone better talk to Calgary, because Calgary is growing, and if it doesn't do a better job of densifying, this place is not going to be what it is in 20, 30 years. Advocate for sustainable forest management. It's a large sector with a large footprint, which is having a profound adverse effect. Is it doing some things good compared to, say, 30, 40 years ago? Absolutely. But has it fully been integrated? No. And does it effectively look at ecological goods and services? No. It talks about it, but the analyses don't fundamentally incorporate it. We need to push for regional protected areas, address climate change, and what we're talking about, and there's no one to look at except us there. It's our per capita energy consumption. And we need to build in natural capital into all of our economic decisions. It's not difficult to do. It's been done time and time again. It's just we don't do it because we think it's going to be difficult. Okay, so there you are. It's easy to make the land users the boogeyman. But no land uses exist without us. They exist because we have demands. So there are you, in your house and your family. And you need wood, you need food, you need minerals, and need energy. So, these are the data on carbon, on water use, and on waste production. And Canada is basically at the top of the world. And in Canada, the top contributor in terms of demand is the province of Alberta. In Alberta, if you were to look at the highest, I think it would be the Calgary-Banff corridor. I mean, we are the people that are using these resources at a rate higher than almost anyone else in the world. So this talk has gone on for about 45 minutes. From the time I started, and every 40-minute period of every day of the year, on average, cities and acreages expanded by 10 hectares. We drilled 14 new wells. We drove 40 million kilometers, produced 4,000 ton of garbage. There's 87 new Albertans from the time I started talking. And we logged 72 hectares. And that'll happen every 40 minutes. And then that'll grow at 2.5%. So my final thoughts, and again, I came to this landscape first time in 1975, where I was asked to look at stream bank integrity in the Bragg Creek and the Elbow. And I've had the great pleasure of hiking and biking and horseback riding, snowshoeing with my family over this landscape. And so I have a bit of perspective, and I love this landscape to death, but it is changing. So some final thoughts from an old wizened guy who doesn't see very well. Still functional, but the form sucks. But I primarily think about, I guess honestly I'm just embarrassed that I'm part of a generation that has created the problems that my grandkids and my kids are going to experience. So we need to be thinking about that meaningful time. So here are my final thoughts. The environmental challenges ahead are profoundly significant, but what is at stake demands our attention. Ignoring these issues will take us to a very bad place. The sustainability solution is not in any way an anti-business strategy. Rather, it is one that incorporates the economic and existent value of natural capital, water, air, land, biodiversity, the spiritual aspects of it too, into the performance metrics that define economic success. Most of these people in this room, we're all business people. We know how to build a business plan. We've just been ignoring some key things. We need to ask ourselves some questions, like what do we want to be when we grow up as a landscape? Because right now, it seems like government and industry and a bunch of us just think we can have it all. That somehow smart people can figure out how everything can happen in space and time. But that's not true. We're literally seeing massive liabilities. So we're collectively using this landscape to death, and we have to learn to live within environmental limits. We've got to stop thinking that we can do everything everywhere all the time. I think we need to move to an approach that says, yeah, we could probably have multiple land uses, but we're going to define the priorities. We have to decide what the priorities are and manage for those. And secondary land uses only exist to the extent that they don't interfere with the priority land uses. So what are those? We must ensure that all land use sectors not only understand best management practices, but deploy them. The Bragg Creek community and environment collectively, I think, again, I don't think we've understood how much power we have. I mean, we're literally holding on to billions of dollars of value every year, and it's not well understood. So we need to help Calgary understand that. Bragg Creek residents and supporters are invested, educated, and affluent, and I think they have the commitment required to meaningfully engage with government and land use sectors on land use plans that allow natural capital to be sustained. So I wanted to thank Bragg Creek Wild for sponsoring this talk. I wanted to thank you for allowing me to share some thoughts. And then I also wanted to identify some of the people that I've talked to recently or a long time ago about Bragg Creek and its issues and how to address it and how to think about it and how to analyze it. So these thoughts, at least the wise ones, didn't come from me. They came from these other people. So thank you very much and for the opportunity to talk to you.